Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast with Chris. Chris, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Can you please introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Sure thing, and thanks for having me. My name's Chris Gilbert. I'm an associate professor at Assumption University, and I teach courses in the English department, specifically focusing in communication and media topics. And so it runs the gamut of things ranging from media literacy all the way up to rhetorical theory and some argument and persuasion mixed in there.
What got you interested in looking into media?
Oh gosh, I actually got very, very interested in Mad Magazine as a kid. It was a big part of my reading diet from when I was a young teenager, and honestly, all the way up through my years as an undergraduate in college. But it wasn't until I was an undergraduate where I started to really unpack advertising in particular, and a number of classes at UMass where I did my undergraduate, and became really fascinated by the ways in which things like advertisements, which seem so ubiquitous and so banal in some ways, they really impact the way in which we imagine ourselves as participating in culture, in public culture. And so that led into a much broader interest in the ways in which messages impact who we think we are and who we pretend to be.
Did you notice the evolution of back then compared to what it is now? I think they have to drop the name, 10 times before someone actually remembers what the name is and it gets stuck in their head. Where I'm like, what was it like? I mean, back in the day, they used to have cocaine mints that you would take, like back in like the Western like advertisements type
Oh
thing.
yeah.
They had cocaine mouth drops. They had mercury, like little things you would do for hair. And now it's just like, you'll see like a Tylenol commercial and they'll like, it's just interesting to see the evolution through our society.
It is. I've actually had students who have been shocked when I've shared with them. I'm like, the reason why Coca-Cola is called Coca-Cola is because there was precisely that in Coca-Cola early on. But yeah, I certainly noticed, evolution is an interesting way to characterize media in a lot of ways too, because it suggests things like this natural selection over the course of time as it relates to technology and how we communicate with one another. But also there's this element of the survival of the fittest that falls into that. And so if you apply that to the way in which media has quote unquote evolved, you start to think differently about the power plays that are involved.
Well, I mean, even look at Coca-Cola. They don't even have to do a commercial anymore. I think they were doing polar bears for a while, and then they would also capture Santa Claus, but then people were getting upset because global warming, obviously, and that's when they took the polar bear off. And then all people obviously don't believe in Santa Claus, so Coke just eliminated that. Now they don't even have to do an advertisement, and people still buy their product.
Yeah, well, what was it? It was a few years ago now where they did that ad campaign where you could have a name printed custom on the side of a Coke can, and that was the way to sort of personalize the brand and sort of take advantage of the brand of Coke, but also your personal brand. So,
Well, that's just
yeah.
like an old tactic, not even just with advertising, but just kind of relating to people by making it more about them. Like, I mean, obviously, it's going to be a long gap. It's going to tie into your book a little bit. But I mean, Rosie the Riveter. I
Yeah.
mean, that's relatable. It told people like, hey, we have to step up. We're just as good. And that's when women started producing a lot of stuff in the factory and people realized, yeah, women can do the same thing. And I mean, it sounds so crazy now, but back then that was revolutionary. And it's like those simple things like Uncle Sam, for instance, wearing a patriotic outfit. I want you. Like he's specifically saying you, and he's wearing basically everything that looks like the homemade apple pie America type deal that they tried to. And I think that's just interesting because it's always something new. And that's what caught me about like propaganda posters. What caught me about all this is because you're looking at it and really no matter what side you're on, you're trying to envision what that mindset of a person coming across it is. And you're like, oh, 100% I'm enlisting. Like that's just gonna happen if you see something like that.
Yeah, well, and I think even uh, in a much more concerning, complicated way, what if we imagine the role of enlistment, or even the willingness to get involved in the war effort, so to speak, in a context like that. It's not that far removed from the way that advertising appeals to an individual to buy into something. And so I think it's really interesting when you start to imagine the relationship between everything from like capitalism as the way that we buy and sell and exchange things, and then democracy as a way to interact with one another and govern ourselves, and then war as a way to defend ourselves. But in the mix of all of those, and sort of something of the glue that ties it all together, is the really challenging ways that we need to find an individual within this collective, right? You buy into the Coke product, but you individualize it to yourself. So now it becomes part of you as a person, and it makes sense. You can imagine yourself in it. Same thing with democracy. It's a bunch of individuals, but how do we imagine ourselves together in some ways, and yet maintaining our individuality? And, then into war efforts as well. What does it mean to imagine yourself as part of it, and to understand that, this defense of our country or our nation is not just about others, soldiers and so on fighting, but no, I need to get into the fight as well. It's not too far removed.
So you started noticing these things that were going on, like just basic advertising tactics, and then it kind of you dived a little bit deeper and you started realizing there was more of a historical kind of perspective on it as well too.
Yeah. Well, and so in the book, Caricature and National Character, um, actually the very first chapter that interested me, the very first chapter that I really started to write when I was composing this book, was the one on Dr. Seuss. And it was because as a child, I became very fascinated with Dr. Seuss, which is not a big surprise. His books are everywhere. We still engage them today. But one thing that struck me with his work is that I had heard that he had done, or at least initially I'd heard he had dabbled in cartooning, but I came to find out that he didn't just dabble. I mean, he was full stop into it, and stopped all of his other illustration and creative work in World War II to then go and devote all of his creative energies to essentially creating propaganda, as you say, in cartoons, in support of the war effort. But the interesting thing is that he came from the advertising world, right? I mean, he was doing advertising illustration for a variety of oil companies and pest control companies and so on. And then he translated his approach to selling those products to selling a way of imagining the war to the American public. And so there is a sales component. There's the idea of selling an idea, selling a feeling, selling a sense of identity. And that is very much what got me into the very notion of national character as something to provide a framework for the book.
I'm still kind of new to what his propaganda was, so you might need to give me some examples. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I came across one where he talked about like the Federal Reserve, and it was like an ostrich and its head in the ground. It was biting roots of something that was like a U.S. bank or something like that. And I mean, that goes into a couple questions. First of all, you don't expect the guy who makes all these Cat in the Hat books to be talking about like the political side. And then I also wonder when that started. When did the propaganda or the politics kind of change? Obviously, we know about political cartoonists, but when did they start throwing jabs at, their own country in a sense as well, too? I mean, I think Trump's probably the best example of someone that's been politically cartoonized in like the worst possible way. But that wasn't always like that. It was more on like the supportive side of like, hey, there's this, and then it's usually going against another country or Russia, somebody. But then it started to become more about, I wouldn't say elite class, but more like banking systems and issues that were going on depending on who the president was. Nixon, I know, has been characterized a couple of times.
Oh yeah, and I mean, you say Trump in the worst ways. I think many would say he's been cartoonized in the best ways, especially if that. Gosh, the prevailing wisdom has been for a long time, well before he became president, that Trump is something of a caricature unto himself. He is sort of a cartoon uh, in body and mind. But to your question about when this sort of propaganda appeared, particularly maybe in editorial cartoons, that, gosh, goes back well before the World War I and World War II eras. You can go back into the 1800s. Look in the middle of the 19th century, and probably some of the most famous cartoons, they weren't toward a president, but they were certainly toward a political figure, would have been Thomas Nast cartoons against so-called Boss Tweed, right? And the in New York City, and it was specifically around the corruption that was taking place in the city, where Boss Tweed would find ways to coerce people into supporting him, immigrants in particular, so that he could advance his own agenda and maintain control in New York City. And so Thomas Nast, cartoonist himself, an immigrant, a German immigrant, became one of his most scathing critics, and he did it through cartoons. And he would expose the corruption and make fun of it, and use it as a way to basically tear down the notion that this person is somehow respectable simply because he's in power. And that was very much a homegrown thing, right? Thomas Nast would be among those cartoonists who would consider themselves to be patriotic in any number of ways that you can imagine that term. And Dr. Seuss wasn't all that different. You know, he comes from that tradition in the sense that here he was doing his illustration work, doing his creative work, and then World War II begins. And then there becomes the concern that the United States needs to somehow get involved because, as all of us know at this point, World War II becomes the good war, because it's either we stop the Nazis or we don't. Either you get involved to take care of this big problem or you don't. And so he started doing his cartoon work among many others who were quite literally recruited to do cartoon work, to do comic work, to do televisual cartoons for military folk as well as ordinary people. You know, they were recruited in order to make this appeal to what it would mean to support the war effort, and so to get involved in a way that would work against things like pacifism and isolationism, and honestly the America First policies that were very popular at that time, which were urging people to stay out of international affairs and just keep everything within our own borders. And so he was among the cartoon, we could say, advocates who would say, no, that's not the way to exist in the world. He was someone who would want to spread democracy as far and wide as possible.
Did it get the message out though? Like, did people consume it? Like, I look at like what we consume today. We consume memes. Memes have somehow taken off in this direction where it's like it's humorous, but you could put up a meme about depression that is basically just like someone crying out like a suicide attempt. But then people laugh and they like it, and it's like it gets your feelings out. But it's like, it does the message get across? I mean, look at the political cartoons. If you're trying to get people to join a war effort, I mean, compared to maybe a more standardized newscast of maybe a president giving a speech or radio television, that might say the message, but is the public soaking it in? And then you have a political cartoon that might throw slant at a war effort, might throw slant at something, might just make a statement. And if it makes you laugh, people consume it and they'll be more likely to spread it around.
Yeah, you know, well, gosh, an ancient problem of communication is, does the message get across? Is it received? And then if it is received, how is it received? And then how is it maybe put into thought, feeling, and action thereafter? Um, with cartoons, you know, so there was an entire committee that was devoted to editorial cartooning work, and it was put together by the government, by the federal government, to actually have these cartoonists and these creators of comics, and then everything all the way up to filmmakers as well, and TV producers and writers, to create something that would look ordinary enough and accessible enough, maybe less official, so to speak, so that an ordinary person could understand it. You know, one of the things that is so powerful about the caricature across history and cartoons, since they've been around in an editorial fashion for a number of centuries now, is that they quote unquote cut to the quick. That is, they're very easy to understand very quickly, right? It doesn't take long to get the punchline, so to speak. It doesn't take long to get the point.
It's like one panel, right? One
Oh,
panel.
exactly. Well, yeah, and if it's an editor, if it's a traditional editorial cartoon, it's just that, literally, quite literally, that one panel, a picture, and then a caption. Sometimes not even a caption. And so, did it get across? Absolutely. Yeah, I think what you get from someone like Dr. Seuss and others who are producing at this time is something of an alternative vocabulary for saying things that, you know, the president and people in official positions of power were also trying to either say or work against, you know, because he was working, Dr. Seuss, against a government that was not interested in getting involved in World War II at the time when he was advocating for it. And so he provides something of an alternative lens. And because it's a comic lens, you know, you have a certain license, you have an affordance to be able to do and say things that you might not get away with in other contexts.
I've heard from a couple of people that we didn't want to get involved in World War II until we eventually got forced to get involved. And so Dr. Seuss had a giant role in kind of helping, or at least getting the American public to at least notice and want the message and actually want to go over there and do something about what was going on.
Yeah, I mean, so isolationism was a big thing at that point. You know, the idea that uh, following World War One, so we had as a culture, as a country, experienced a world war. There was a pretty long memory of what that war was like for people who had undergone, you know, what is entailed in a world war. And so there were a handful of people who I think culturally and just civically felt like the United States did not need to get involved and was comfortable enough in its own position. Yes, as a world power, because you know, as soon as we get to the turn of the 20th century in the Spanish American War, following that moment, there are notions that we're getting into the age of American empire. You know, there's a big long reach of American culture at that point, and yet that was a reason for a lot of people to say, like, yeah, let's actually, in this context, in this situation, let's isolate ourselves, let's stay out of it, let's let them deal with their problems overseas, and we'll take care of our own here. And that again is where you get the burgeoning America First movement, essentially, where you're getting folks like Charles Lindbergh and others who are saying, no, I mean, we need to focus all of our energies on our own culture and our own nation. And so that's precisely what Dr. Seuss was railing against, and that's where you get those comic images of the ostrich with its head in the sand, and you can play out that conventional wisdom about, if you stick your head in the sand, you're purposefully ignoring stuff that's really consequential around you, but probably to your own detriment. And that was one of his main points.
Did you look at see if he got any criticism from the general public because it wasn't maybe used to any of their stuff, or did the war or any military say something like try and isolate his stuff so nobody could find it?
Well, he was among those who were promoted. I mean, he started out very independently, um, publishing his work through various publications and newspapers, and so his work got out there. He ended up stopping his editorial cartooning work in order to go and help to make films, actually, cartoon films. But I would say, in terms of the criticism he got, yeah, sure, he would have gotten criticism in the moment from those who were of the isolationist camp. You know, so anyone, especially the people that he was railing against, like a Charles Lindbergh, he became, because he was sort of a figurehead of America First policymaking. He was very much a subject of Dr. Seuss's ridicule, and so certainly from that sort of camp, he would have gotten pushback. But interestingly, a lot of the pushback that he's gotten in more recent times, and there have actually been articles within the last 5-10 years that have taken on Dr. Seuss's editorial cartooning and calling it stereotypical and sometimes even racist or ethnocentric, because unfortunately, but also of course, as a product of their times, these sorts of editorial cartoons draw on the stereotypes and the typecasts that allow us to give a sense of, here's a self that we can identify with, here's an other that we want to disidentify with, and the stereotype becomes a very easy way to do that. And of course, in that moment, you get stereotypes of Asians, you get stereotypes of Russians and Russian soldiers, of Germans, and so on.
I know, like Bugs Bunny, there's
Yeah.
a
Oh yeah.
couple horrifying images of what they were doing. You're like, oh my God, they
Absolutely.
let this play on television. But that's the thing, is like the times have completely changed. We obviously know that was bad. You know, we can't do that. You know, don't do that stereotypical stuff. And back then they had no clue about it. They just thought it was comedy. They thought it could relate to something. It could help identify yourself compared to whatever that they were trying to propagandize or talk about. I'm just curious to when it comes to this aspect of getting people to actually start providing and sparking a movement on it. I mean, you got to think, if you're just, it's a political cartoon as well too. And I get, like, I'm sure they didn't slip it into, like, some of his regular kids cartoons. Hopefully he didn't. But you have a lot of people that are now, I mean, you're reaching out, I guess, not only to a new audience, but a different audience compared to what you're originally doing cartoons for. And you're doing a whole different message, and the importance that it actually played, like getting someone to soak that up. I mean, do you think it was this aspect of, like, if you analyze, I guess, maybe the beginnings of some political cartoons compared to the transformation that they had, or the evolution that they had, did they have this more idea of trying to tackle the patriot angle? which is like something I've talked about a couple of times. I've talked a lot of trash on the government, but I also am a patriot at heart. I think you got to recognize corruption, but there is that sense of this is my land, this is my home, this is where my family is, this is who we are, and it's that flag. Like that's why we have patriotic songs here today as well too.
Yeah, I mean, he definitely would have tapped into it. I think he would be among those, and Thomas Nast, who I mentioned not long ago, would be in this camp as well. He would be among those who would say part of what it means to um, identify yourself with this or that nation or this or that collective group of people is to be willing to defend it in some way, shape, or form, right? And so I think in a democratic state, especially one that's built on principles of liberty and equity and fair play and the pursuit of happiness and all of those other foundational principles that we have, there is a sense among many that would that that's a foundation for those in the country, right? So those who live here, those who have family and friends here. But it's also something in the face of, say, tyranny elsewhere and in the face of fascism elsewhere that you need to expand in order to get out there more broadly in the world. That was part of Dr. Seuss's point. His concern was that you were getting ethnocentric and racist factions in the US that were purposefully trying to do the sorts of things that they were trying to do in the home, in the home space to push people out of politics, push people out of culture, and they were trying to do that in the wider world as well. And he found that to be very concerning. And so it becomes interesting when you start to imagine that he was both appealing to a sense of, a sharing of this democratic spirit. He was doing that, but he was also doing the racist and the ethnocentric kinds of appeals in his comedy. And so that's a tension that exists in any kind of cartoon work that is really getting embroiled in politics and probably especially war, is you run that risk of how at what point do we go too far with the comic license, at what point do we cross lines, and so part of what it means to be a patriot for someone like him is to push those boundaries in order to make your point.
I want to ask, it's going to be a little bit of a weird question because it requires some speculation, I would say.
As I tell my students, I love weird, so let's go for
Do
it.
you think that it kind of formed a little bit or kind of was like the true resemblance of the American mold? Like this idea of like you can't be so disconnected? Because I think at this point today, everyone's really interested in politics because it's in our faces 24/7. And if you kind of look back then, besides being at war or looking at a poster, a lot of people didn't want to get into like the government stuff, didn't really want to focus a whole bunch. They knew who they'd like to vote for based on like the American apple pie version, like we talk about. But it seemed like these types of cartoons were not only just a message, but it was a way to try and bring people to be like, hey, this is important to pay attention to, that there are real issues. So you're kind of tapping into the audience that is kind of out of it, but also tapping to the audience that's also in it.
Yeah, well, and so to answer the question about the American mold, I think what you find, well, let me back up. I'll say we used to, I think, as a culture, approach something like war as a moment of crisis, right? And so what I mean by that is we have, over the course of time and over the course of a history together as a culture, moments that stand out and they get punctuated, and it's sort of like, wow, this is really consequential. We need to do something. We need to act in certain ways. We need to be in certain ways. And so you find that in war times. You can think about that obviously during World War I, World War II. War times become really interesting moments of time to mark this, right? What do we mean by who we are as a people? Vietnam War, civil rights movement, that whole era, post 9/11 versus pre 9/11, right? I mean, you get these very powerful moments where we kind of step back and almost have like a national identity crisis along with whatever crisis is going on in the world. And so in terms of the mold, I think what you're finding nowadays, as opposed to like now as opposed to then, is politics for a lot of people in the American public, I think, was something that you did occasionally, something that you got involved with say during elections, during war times, during moments where it seemed like it was really important. And otherwise, it was sort of like, we live in a republic at the end of the day. And so we let representatives do the political work while we carry on with our ordinary lives. Nowadays, what I think we see is that politics is an everyday thing, but not in the sense of practicing, say, democracy in any way that we could imagine, like in the ancient Greek moment, but instead to say politics is really cultural politics. It's about advocating for and defending a very particular way of being as it stands against, say, another way of being. And to call politics that kind of work is to think about it very different than, say, policy making, or very different than, say, getting involved in a war or being a pacifist. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, you started chapter one off with Dr. Seuss. I'm curious too, did you come across anything that was as impactful as what he was doing? I mean, like, I don't know if it goes back farther than him. I know you mentioned a couple examples, but Dr. Seuss is just a big name. It's going to connect with a lot of like people of my generation. So I consider him would be like a good
Well,
start to like you want him on your team. I'm just curious to if there was another event or any other names that came a little bit later that might have done it in their own style and had a different kind of impact.
oh, yeah, I mean, there have been many, and there are still many. And actually, Dr. Seuss is the second chapter in the book. The first chapter is on James W. Flagg, and so, or James Montgomery Flagg, sorry. So James Montgomery Flagg is the original artist of the "I Want You" poster, right? And so he was also an illustrator for magazines initially, and then he got roped into doing the propaganda poster that we all recognize now, which is, of course, Uncle Sam pointing at you and looking for military conscription, looking for people to enlist. And so he becomes something of a foundational figure in my approach to how caricature gets used in editorial cartoons to push notions of national character, especially in war times, because his work really starts to shift the valence from, you know, we do wars every now and again, and we have kind of a warring spirit every now and again when we need to this notion that no, war is actually built into the very principle of democracy. And so I don't necessarily mean that in terms of the violence that it brings, but something of like a conflicting spirit that pits us versus them in a variety of different ways. And so, of course, in a wartime, the foil for that becomes it's us as the friends on one side and them as the enemies on another side. And it tends to be a conflict, across international borders. But it wasn't that long before, and of course Thomas Nast in the 19th century, who I mentioned earlier, he's in the long shadow of the Civil War, and that was obviously an internal conflict. And so part of what Thomas Nast, as figures before Dr. Seuss, were grappling with in their cartoons was what it even meant to be a democratic nation that was built on a violent act from the very get-go, right? And not to say that it was at all wrong to pursue a revolution, to along with it pursue the American experiment, but we need to grapple with the fact that democracy as a peaceful enterprise begins with very violent beginnings. And so that's a style that carries through. It's something that you see in a lot of cartoons, especially during war times leading up to Dr. Seuss. And thereafter, I finish off the book. We don't need to go to the end right now, but with a cartoonist who's still very active right now. Her name's Ann Telnaes. And she has, for most of her career, done these very interesting, quite simple drawings that make very powerful points about who we are relative to quote unquote others, whether those others be other members of the body politic that we live in or people who live in other countries.
Who understood the national identity or national character? Like even the concept, like how did that even come to being of identifying yourself with the idea of a nation or the ideals of a nation?
That's a really good question. And so that's actually something that sparked my interest in the topic to begin with. And so if you think about it, I mean, you can go back to Ben Franklin, right? So Ben Franklin initially in the founding period is among the first public figures and obviously political advocates for America as we know it to suggest that in order to survive as a country that is going after something like a democratic way of being, we need to both maintain our revolutionary or individual spirit, right? You need to have that, but you also need to have a way to exist together. And you also have to have a way to understand, and we even say this today, right? Understand ourselves as one people. And so that goes back to a lot of the work that he was doing in cartoons too, by the way. He used to do his own political cartoons in order to advocate for what he saw as unifying what was becoming an American nation. But we don't even call it really America a nation until you get closer to the Civil War era. You know, understanding ourselves as a nation is something that comes along with establishing a national government as opposed to a collection of states. It doesn't come about until you start to realize that, hey, you might be living down in Georgia and I'm up here in Massachusetts, but we're somehow all part of the same thing that we're calling America. You know, that is something that takes quite a bit of time. And even to this day, there are people who would say we have two Americas in this country. There's one America over here that believes such and such about the American founding and how it impacts how we live today. And then there's another side of America that represents some other form of it. And so I think that idea that we have a character, you know, we have a way of being, an ethic, a set of principles, that has been a problem to struggle over since the founding period through to the present day. And many people have, scholars, but also just us right now, right? I mean, we talk about it as ordinary people, what it means to be an American, what it means to act as if you are one. And then characters like Uncle Sam become representatives for that. They become icons. You want to do your part in World War One, right? Then listen to Uncle Sam, who is the representative of the country, and he wants you, right? He wants you to enlist in the army. And so to be a good American in that context, to have character, right, to be a person of principles, is to get involved in the war effort.
I want to ask this real quick. Before it became a nation, before it was like just a nation, it was more of an ideology. Was it more of this like people knew the basic like how in America, how to be an American, but they never talked about it in this uniformed sense?
Yeah. Well, kind of, yes. Yeah. Since so I say kind of because you know there's a lot of influence in the founding period of obviously earlier democracies. You know, we love to say these days that the American democratic experiment is the only one that has been able to really survive. It's been the only one that has been able to last as long as it has, because we saw, you know, what is often pointed to as the best of all democracies in history, you know, in Athens in ancient Greece, it collapsed, right? It fell to tyranny. And we saw the Roman Republic, which was, you know, this bastion of culture and politics. It also collapsed. It also fell. But in the founding period, you get people referring to Rome as, and even to Athenian democracy, as so crucial because it's not about a foundation on blood and soil per se, although that was very much a part of the ancient Roman way of life. It was found on an idea, right? And so to be one of that nation, meaning a person who's involved and interested in that nation, you need to get in with you need to be on board with the idea, right? You need to announce yourself and accept yourself as somebody who supports the very idea that is that country or nation, as opposed to saying that it will simply survive because it is America or because it is a democracy. You know, it requires participation in that idea before it can even be something like a nation.
Did you come across through your work that the examination of Uncle Sam was the literal depiction of the state of America? Like, not just the idea, like, here's America, it's Uncle Sam, is this, but he evolved. Like, there were times I've seen cartoons where Uncle Sam looked like he was a junkie, like, he was very, very scrawny. He looked like he couldn't even stand up straight, like, people had to support him, and they would have people like the Federal Reserve or things that were supporting Uncle Sam as his crutches. And I want to know when that first starts, when people start depicting him in that way, because I have to think in the beginning, now that he's, I mean, this nation character, he's like the beloved. When did I guess the tables kind of turn where it started to become more of a shift, or the balance and the scale shifts to more of this aspect of like calling out the issues that are going on and recognizing the problems that are happening?
Yeah, well, and so you say the tables turn. I think the tables have turned many times, many times on Uncle Sam. So Uncle Sam, there are a variety of ways in which people would chart his history, but there are plenty who would say that the foundations of Uncle Sam as an iconic figure of America, as an embodiment of the U.S., actually goes back to like Yankee Doodle as something of a trickster figure who appeared in the Revolutionary period as a figure that British soldiers would use to make fun of America. So like Yankee Doodle was a comic foil for saying like, look how ridiculous Americans are, look how unkempt they are, look how foolish they are as figures. But then of course we embrace that, right? We figured out a way to say like, no, Yankee Doodle is ours, and we're gonna own that figure, but we're gonna turn the table of what the British would say and do something else with it. And so that happens as the figure of Uncle Sam emerges too. So Uncle Sam actually, in some of the lore about him, is an actual figure in the sense that there would be obviously munitions and rations supplied to soldiers, and the initials US would get stamped on the side, and the idea was that it was coming from an actual person, and US becomes Uncle Sam. Sam was the name of the person who was delivering some of the things, and then of course it stands for US as well. And so it's like, oh, there's the overlap. So from that actual literal embodiment of something happening in the world, we start to get representations of Uncle Sam as a figure. But you see Uncle Sam as a figure even predating the World War I and World War II eras. So like in the moment of the Spanish-American War, where he wasn't a laudable figure for many cartoonists, he was an object of ridicule in the sense that he was considered an imperialist. So he wasn't the scrawny figure that you were just referencing. He was actually this bloated sort of, I'm coming in and I'm consuming everything. I'm taking this culture. I'm being a colonist. I'm colonizing, other countries and other areas in order to expand what was becoming at the turn of the 20th century, what folks have called the American Empire. And then of course you get him in later iterations in the civil rights movement and during the Vietnam era, where there's a famous depiction of him where he's not pointing and saying, I want you, but he's actually giving the middle finger. Right. And it almost does like a comic gesture to say like, I actually don't care about you as a citizenry. And so I think he as a figure is always undergoing these various iterations depending on who or what is trying to do something with the power that figure represents.
Now, do you see when they drop off from just Uncle Sam in general and they take a shift to more of individuals? Like I've seen so many people, like it says H.B. Rockefeller, and then it has him with a bloated gut. He's like drinking it, but it's always like that. And then they started targeting more towards presidents, and it kind of seems like for a good time period where Uncle Sam just dropped off. I think you might see glimpses of it more towards like the 90s and the 2000s. Like people will do like a throwback of it or something. But there was a period where it was completely off of Uncle Sam, and that was more directed to the actual people that are literally calling the shots, not this idea of America anymore. It's like people are now not identifying with the problem being the country. Now it's identifying with the person who's leading it. And I think that's where you get to today's time where you say there's separate Americas. It's more divided in politics and stances now compared to the idea of like the American belief, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's a good observation. And I look at Ollie Harrington's work, who was a cartoonist actually across the Cold War, went into exile because he was subject to the will of the House Un-American Activities Committee when he was doing his work initially. But he's one of those cartoonists who sort of typifies that the move that you're talking about. He does not necessarily rely on those iconic representations of Uncle Sam to make his point about America, but instead will caricature folks like Nixon. He will caricature war generals who are perpetrating the Vietnam War at that time. And part of the point in doing that, I think, especially in a cartoon space, is to be able to make fun, not of the country itself, right? Because I think there's this sense that it's too easy to either simply celebrate or simply ridicule America as a nation, as an idea, as whatever it might be, it's much more valuable to recognize that it's the people in power, or it's even the ordinary people who actually make America what it is, right? And so it's the virtues and the vices of the people who are actually living it on a daily basis and making policy or making other political decisions. And so Uncle Sam, I think you're right to some extent, drops off as a target because he's not enough of a comic foil to make the point about particular actors out there that were doing things that cartoonists found to be wrong or reprehensible or whatever it might be in terms of the work that they were trying to do in advocacy.
I'm not going to get into deep state talk, but I've seen so many political cartoons that talk about the military industrial complex, and they mention a lot of this, like where it comes to budgeting and it comes to all this. And I'm curious if that's the type, like, do you see that more modern day where people mention individual problems? Like I've seen plenty of political cartoons on the CIA, especially during the Watergate era. I mean, the FBI was lit up a couple of times in there. And you just get into this aspect of like, okay, well, it's shifted completely from an ideology now to more focused institutions. I mean, there's plenty of Wall Street political cartoons that even get made today, reenacting, the issue with Wall Street and a bunch of that stuff.
Yeah, I mean that's Ollie Harrington's work in a nutshell. He's someone who was very much concerned about what we now would characterize as systemic problems that America was facing with, and so as a black cartoonist working from the Cold War period all the way through, the 80s and 90s, he saw everyone from FDR all the way through to Jimmy Carter and into the almost into the Reagan era, and so he was very much aware of the ways in which, as you say, institutions start to expand and really impact the way in which culture develops, the way in which a people thrive or not. And so you see his own critiques of uh, the military industrial complex for sure. You see his own critiques of the ways in which, poverty in certain spaces becomes a result of systemic issues that are driven by governmental policy, that are driven by people in power who, decide to do this or that with the money that they have and the power that they have access to. And so, yes, I think it very much becomes a combination of the individual who is the representative of, say, Wall Street, or the representative of the military industrial complex, like a president or a war general. But then it's also the institutions themselves that become problematic. I mean, there are many, many cartoons in Ollie Harrington's body of work where he will depict a war general as a missile unto himself, right? And but a missile that, again, that bloated theme is bloated with food and power, but also military might, and the ability to actually enact violence in particular ways. And then he'll also represent Wall Street as, something like a vulture that feeds on feeds on the dead, right? Feeds on what we would see as the things that are subject to demise, and to things like poverty, and to things like malnourishment, and so on. And so absolutely that's a part of his work and other cartoonists of that time.
I believe I saw one that was a vulture stealing a wallet out of somebody's pocket, and it was like it was a wallet. Then there was a piggy bank version of it as well too. Uh, did you look at any of the time period during the Industrial Revolution? Maybe not so much propaganda, but it seems to me from what I've come across is that it's like a clear marking of like this is a turning point when it started becoming pointing at the wealthy elite, like the wealthy percenters, the ones that weren't suffering as much, which I would think like if this has been around for a long time, it would have been during the Great Depression when you would have saw, political cartoons. And I'm sure there might have been some, but from what I've seen, it's a clear marking of like people that were, covered in dirt and were very, very small on the page compared to the other ones that were sitting, maybe eating a steak and wearing like a Monopoly Man outfit.
Yeah. And I mean, my gosh, yeah. So did I study particular cartoons from the Industrial Revolution? No. But because this book in particular was focused on war times, I obviously made decisions about which war times I thought I wanted to use as markers for particular moments that were worth considering in terms of national character. But what you're describing was very prominent among cartoonists, uh, again, in the mid 19th century, I mentioned Thomas Nast. He's considered by many the father of American cartooning. And it's in part because he becomes something of a representative, an immigrant himself, who is trying to pursue what we might characterize as the American dream and live out the idea and the ideals of what it is to be an American. And he's doing it in the face of what he sees as corruption. So he's doing it in the face of people who seem to be exploiting, quote unquote, the system for their own personal gain to the detriment of others. And so that theme of the individual being able to pursue his or her or their own, happiness and their own well-being in this space, that is not just a comic foil, but a foil across the board for ways to understand the relationship between the individual person who is trying to make it and then the other person who either has made it or has been born into being made, and is able to take advantage of things that other ordinary people cannot. And so you see that in a lot of cartoons in the mid 19th century from Nast. You see it at the turn of the century when you look at the Spanish-American War and how America is represented as now the one who's kind of, now we were revolutionaries and we were ones who were trying to pave a better way for a people, and now we're doing what we said we weren't going to do, which is we're colonizing, right? We're taking over the resources of other groups and of other people, and so kind of becoming what we said we should not become. And so that theme runs deep, very deep, across editorial cartoons in the US, gosh, for the last century and a half, maybe even longer.
I'm sure in today's time, most Americans have, I guess, judgments about the government. I'm curious, you probably came across a lot of interesting stuff that you put in your book, but what's one thing that you were like, not really horrified, but just it was dark and it had you made me think a little bit differently about things? You had to come across at least one thing that might have even been hard to even kind of, either admit that it was true or just even examine just because of the way something might have changed your idea going into it a little bit.
Yeah, you mean about the government that I would find in cartoons?
Something secret.
Oh, geez.
Illuminati things would be nice if you had like something with a pyramid and an eye.
Yeah, no, I definitely don't get into conspiracy theorizing. But my gosh, I think what you find when you look at a body of editorial cartooning work, especially when you look at an era around something like World War II, is how intimately connected an official body of communication to the public becomes to what we think is a more ordinary way of communicating through something like editorial cartoons. So what I was surprised by was that there was an entire, I mean, I wasn't surprised, but I was surprised when I found that there was a committee for public information, right, that emerged in the World War I and World War II eras. And of course, the idea is we're saying information, but it's an outlet for propaganda. And then realizing the power of cartoons, those in the committee start to rope in editorial cartoonists and illustrators in order to exploit the power of comics in order to propagandize, right? In order to put out a war message. And so what you start to see is the power of a governmental body to almost become like a gravitational force for the things that matter in culture, to pull the things in so that it now becomes harnessed for whatever is the agenda of the government in that moment. And that, was it surprising? No. Was it horrifying? Because it's in the face of war, a little bit, because what you realize is you're starting to utilize a cartoon and a body of cartoon work to advocate for what is at the end of the day very violent activity. That's a bit concerning. And then to realize the extent to which cartoonists would rely and very consciously on pretty awful stereotypes of other people in order to do that work. That's not conspiratorial. It's real. And it's something that I think over the course of doing this work stood out more and more and more, especially as something to pay attention to when you are either finding yourself agreeing or disagreeing with that, with whatever the message might be in the cartoon.
Especially when you start looking at everything you were taught in history, then you find like the real kind of story about it a little bit. Like we blindly justified a lot of our actions on the sense of that it was an enemy, and you start realizing this idea like I mean, they try to kill Castro 693 times. I don't care who you are and what bad stuff he's doing. That's a lot. And it went to really dark extents, and the public went with it because they felt like that's what you had to do because they had been told and propagandized that this person is an enemy. And that's how we looked at the Vietnam War. We weren't considering them people anymore. It wasn't, I'm got to survive. It was this aspect of we got to take out the enemy. And that's many statements that are like that. And it just makes you question things more like, what am I doing in my own life that's been I've been told one thing, it's the complete opposite thing. You know, it's hard to confront those ideas. I'm curious if any political cartoonist really sparked a message in anybody that had them questioning a lot of things that were commonly told to them and they realized it's kind of a lie.
Yeah, well, I mean, so
I mean, the cover of your book is perfect. It's Uncle Sam walking off a cliff. I mean, that has a deep message to it.
yeah, well, blindfolded and holding a gun.
Yeah.
um, yeah, well, and so you can kind of see the embedded critique of even cartoon propaganda in that very cover image. But I know we've talked about Dr. Seuss a bit, but Dr. Seuss he really is an interesting figure. He's there's a reason why he became my first interest in this book. There are many reasons, but one is because of what you're saying. His cartoon work, I think, got people to reimagine how it is they took the information about, in that case, isolationism as a virtue, right? And so most of his cartoon work was saying, no, you're being told by a governmental body that to stay out of the war is the best way to be an American. And that's not the case, because what we're doing is we're missing an opportunity to defend what democracy even is and what it is to even pursue an American experiment. And so there's that angle of things. But what he also shows in a very powerful and sometimes perverse way is that, and this stood out in particular cartoons that he would do, he revealed that you can take the advertising principles that work to sell products to sell principles of political action. And so there's this one theme that really stood out to me in his work early on in my research. And it's that when he was advertising for a company called Flit, which used to have this, it's essentially a pest control company. And you would utilize what we now look as pesticides in order to kill bugs, right? I mean, none of this is that shocking to people these days. He used that exact same imagery and the exact same ideas of killing a pest to do his cartoon work when he would say the Asian population, the German population, the Russian population, right? These are pests. These are things that we should treat as insects. These are things that, like, they're not people, they're things, right? They're critters, they're gross, they're enemies of us, they're creatures, they get in the way of what we want to be doing. And so we should kill them in the same way. And so you get that dehumanizing element of cartoon work in his editorial cartoons in that era, in the World War II era. And that was disturbing, right? Especially as someone who, you say, in your generation, I know that I'm a little bit further removed from your generation. But I mean,
I'm 42.
What's that?
I said I'm 42.
You're 42?
No, I'm not 42.
I was gonna say.
reverse the number. I'm 24.
There you go. Yeah. So I'm 39. Right. And so not super far removed, but removed enough. But Dr. Seuss was a staple of my childhood. And then when you start to imagine the ways in which some of those themes even carried over into the ways that he approached his illustration and story writing thereafter, you can recognize that the impact is not just figurative, it's not just ideological, it's very real. It's very real.
In today's times, there's a lot of people that go through an existential crisis about just where they are. Why is America so far removed? I'm like, well, it's kind of always been this way, but it's just the fact that we have a lot more exposure onto a lot of these things now. Before the history books, I mean, they could choose what they wanted to insert in and the amount of influence that was in there as well, too. And I go, but it's the same thing. I mean, if you look at just character slander in general, it's might have changed forms on the aspect of we don't just go after a nation now, we go after certain individuals, people in power. Even during the debates, there's people that are making memes or whatever about a certain character that are just over exaggerated features that they might have. For instance, I mean, you can pick the whole gambit, but it's the message is still there. This is not nothing new. The technology might be different, but I'm very interested in how that's been something that's stayed attached, that has been this concept of like, it's not just dehumanizing, but if you can make this person so much that you don't care what would happen to them. And it's like that goes against a lot of people's beliefs and kind of what you're raised about, like everybody love everybody in this sense. But like there are certain things, like it doesn't matter if it's someone, a political figure, it doesn't matter if it's Monsanto's. I hate that crop company, I really do. But the message soaks in when you start realizing the propaganda message either to cover their ass or people that are attacking them. And you just realize like you immediately get a furnace burning inside of you. And it just, that has always been there, and it might have shifted, but someone figured that out. And that's fascinating.
Yeah, well, and as I said a moment ago, the founding period was nothing if not influenced by uh, ancient ideas of democracy. I mean, how could it not be? You're getting a lot of these really smart guys and well-to-do guys and people in power, and they're thinking about ways in which societies have been built in the past and how can we transpose that into something in the present and do it in a way that we want to make this experiment work for us, right? But what you get embedded in the very foundation of this country, and then of course it comes out when you have some of Ben Franklin's cartoons, again, because that's kind of my angle on things. It's one of the things that clearly that I'm interested in. You're getting phrases like "Don't tread on me," right? That come out of that, and you're getting appeals to being united instead of divided, in the snake image that everybody's familiar with, and all of this join or die, right? That comes out of Ben Franklin. But my point is that in that very moment, there's this really deep tension between demophilia and demophobia. So it's the fear of the people and the friendship and love of the people. And it's not only a byproduct of people in power, it's also what comes with developing oneself as a democracy. Demos, right? The word is still there. That's what demos means. It means the people, right? And so when you take this organization of people who you're kind of told, like, I know you're strangers, but we're all Americans, so let's be friends. That's weird, right? That's a hard thing to grapple with. And so it's in part why you see the character attack become a very powerful way early on of doing democratic politics, right? Because it's a way to say, like, look, this person is not being the way an American should be. I'm being the way an American should be. And that's the character we should carry forward. And so that's something, and I say this to my students all the time. You think we're divided now, especially through media. My gosh, go look in the early 1800s at newspapers. Look at the journalism that was taking place in the Civil War era, and wow, I mean, there's stuff that we might even be shocked by in terms of what people were saying to one another and about one another. So it's been around for a long, long time.
Do you have any ideas of if you were going to write another book, where would you focus on?
I am writing another book right now, actually.
Ooh.
Yeah, I'm about halfway through the second book here, and the tentative title is "When Comedy Goes Wrong," and so it's not looking at cartoons per se. It's actually looking at the comic principle itself, and what I'm interested in at this point is how it is in this country in particular, comedy has undergone a shift from sort of the 1980s until the present day through to the present day. So I think it's going on right now where it's doing different things than we expect comedy to do, or what we think comedy should do. And so I'm looking at a variety of things from talk radio all the way through to the January 6th insurrection, right? And figuring out where the comic elements lie in moments as various and as seemingly divergent as those. And I've even got a chapter on the film Joker as a way to understand the comic principle. It's actually a chapter that I just recently finished. So it's good. It's fun, but it's really looking at the comic principle itself. And so figuring out what it is we mean by it, how it has undergone shifts, what its role in society is. I talk a little bit about cancel culture, lots of different stuff in the book, but it's in progress. So that's what I'm doing right now.
I'll have to get you back on to talk about that one when it comes out. But for now, the book that you do have out there, please, where can people find your links? Where can people find your book?
Yeah, so Amazon is probably the easiest way if you want to go onto Amazon and get that. If you have the capacity to do this, I could certainly send you along the link. But I know that on Amazon, it's in the hardcover is in the neighborhood of $30 or so. You can get it on straight from the press, Penn State University Press. I know that it's going to go into paperback sometime early in the spring. You can get it on as a digital book as well, and so it's quite accessible. If you literally these days just punch into Google Caricature and National Character and my name, it'll pop right up.
Twitter?
Oh yeah, you could certainly circulate it on Twitter.
No,
Absolutely.
I meant, do you have a Twitter?
Oh, do I have Twitter? No, I don't. No, so
Good
I'm
for
a little
you.
bit. I am a little bit of a Luddite, so I'm someone who resists technology a little bit. So I don't participate in social media.
That's good.
I
I
live.
only do a post a day.
Yeah, well, it's good. It's good on you. I live on a little homestead here in New England, and so when I'm not doing my work and reading and writing and teaching, I'm out on a farm.
Well, look, I'm going to link all your links in the description for people to be able to find them. It was a pleasure chatting with you, and thanks for listening to this episode out of the